Welcome everybody to this update webinar related to brain development. We have a good combination of people here today. We're about evenly split between 4-H and Family and Consumer Sciences people, with a few people who also have county coordinator kinds of responsibilities. So hopefully this is going to be something that is useful for all of you. My goal is to introduce this topic, give you some information, some ideas, and then at the end to allow a little bit of time for us to talk about the so what question. What does this mean for you? What does this mean for your programming in your program area? And I'm hoping this is the beginning of a discussion that will continue later on after this webinar as well. So this is really just intended to kind of get you started understanding the issue of executive function. We've got three basic objectives for today's webinar. I'm hoping at the end that you'll be able to define what executive functioning is, to identify skills and examples that make up executive functioning, and then to be able to describe strategies adults can use to help children and adolescents improve executive functioning skills. We're going to take a look at the entire range from infancy all the way up through adolescence. So those of you who are 4-H people, don't worry, this is not just an infant and toddler focused thing. The issue of executive function is an issue for for all ages and all stages of development. And of course, if you've got questions, if you've got ideas, you're welcome to type them into the chat box. You're welcome to raise your hand, and I will certainly allow you to speak if you've got microphone capability. And so we will kind of get started with the content, and then be thinking about how this applies to your areas of extension responsibility. So to start out, if we're going to talk about executive function or executive functions, there are a number of terms that get used sort of interchangeably. Executive functions are a series of higher order thinking skills that are sometimes collectively referred to as executive function or sometimes executive functioning. And so you see all of these terms kind of used interchangeably. And these higher order thinking skills are what enable us to engage in complex problem solving and goal-directed behavior. And these are things that we use all the time as adults. Can anybody think of a time recently, today or yesterday, when you did problem solving or you engaged in some sort of goal-directed behavior? If you want to speak, speak, or if you want to talk or type, feel free to type. Looking for examples of goal-directed behavior or problem solving in your own life. Processing changes with the county. Kim, yes, I feel sure that that took a lot of both goal-directed behavior and creative problem solving. Planning an event, making changes to an existing event, absolutely. Even if you've done it before, the circumstances are not necessarily exactly the same. And so you've got to be flexible, you've got to evaluate, to plan based on what you understand about what went well, what didn't go well last time. If you're starting from scratch, you've got to build based on other experiences and knowledge of both the content area and the audience. Absolutely. Anybody else have an example? Working on the 4-H banquet, dealing with dozens of late additions. Great specific example, Terry. Things change in our world and in extension, and I'm sure any of you who have worked in extension for any period of time would agree with that. And so the flexibility that is required to deal with those kinds of things is requires executive function skills. Feel free to keep coming up with examples, and as you do, and we'll refer back to those, I want you to understand all of these skills we use all the time. They're important in adult life. They're important in children's and adolescents' lives as well. And they're largely primarily controlled in a part of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex, which is developmentally the last part of the brain to begin developing and to finish developing. So those of you who work directly with young people, or those of you who work with those who work with young people, know that many of them do not have this ability well developed during the time that you're working with them. And you'll be familiar with some of the complications that causes. Here's a particular breakdown of the different kinds of executive functions. Activation, how to organize, prioritize, get yourself to work, get yourself to school, break down a task into different pieces and components. Focus, focused attention, selective attention. We'll talk about this a lot because it's an important piece of executive function. Paying attention to the task at hand, paying attention to the task that is the most important for what you're doing at the time, and ignoring distractions. Effort, being involved, sustaining your work on something, being alert, adjusting how fast you're working based on circumstances. Emotions, which we sometimes don't realize are a part of every problem solving. Terry, I'm sure the dozens of late additions to the 4-H banquet have aroused some frustrations, some emotions in your dealing with that circumstance. And in order to successfully deal with it, you have to know how to deal with those emotions and not let those emotions get the better of you so that you can't deal with the task at hand. Memory is also important, and particularly what we call working memory, the ability to keep things in mind, to compare multiple pieces of information, to work with that information, and then also to retrieve stored memories so that you can juggle multiple tasks, remember instructions, and so on. And then action, the ability to monitor how are you doing, what progress are you making, what action is next, what steps you need to follow, and so on. So all of these, if you think about how complicated these are, all of these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And in some ways, we can think of executive function as the brain's air traffic control system. If you think about the job of an air traffic controller or a series of air traffic controllers managing our airspace, the air traffic controllers have to juggle a lot of things. They have to know where multiple airplanes are at a time. They've got to know this in three-dimensional space because they can be at different altitudes as well as different places on the map. They've got to know airspeed, landing schedules, takeoff schedules. They've got to be able to filter out distractions, prioritize tasks, control their impulses to just say, oh, fine, land wherever you want to. Those kinds of things. The same kind of thing is happening in the brain when we think about all of these skills that we've just looked at. In order to be able to do a complex task successfully, you've got to be able to juggle your focus and your memory and your organization and deal with your emotions, inhibit your impulses, all of those kinds of things all at the same time. So as this executive function ability develops, it is essentially the ability to maintain control over the processes that lead to successful management of problem solving. And all of these things are being controlled in a part of the brain that we call the cerebral cortex. Sorry, I was trying to highlight it and I didn't have the right color to do that. The cerebral cortex here. Let's try that again. Sorry, this highlighting is a great idea, except when it doesn't work well. So the cerebral cortex, the outermost part of the brain, which is the part that is responsible for the most high-level functions. And specifically within the cerebral cortex, there is a part of the brain known as the frontal lobe. The frontmost part of that brain is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain where executive function is dealt with and managed. And as I said before, this is a part of the brain that is not well developed until fairly late in development. So those of you, how many of you work with children, youth under about age 15? Many of you 4-Hers probably do, or 4-H agents probably do. Any of you work with, any of you have young children of your own under about age 12 to 15? All of those kinds of things, yes, those are people who still don't have this frontal area, this prefrontal cortex well developed. And so you see a lot of issues with executive function, especially in younger kids. And any of you who have worked with adolescents know there are big differences in maturity between a 12-year-old and a 16 or 17-year-old. And so you see these differences as this part of the brain develops. So let's take a little more of a look at what executive function skills are, some examples, and then some of the things that are required in order for executive function to happen and to be successful. So looking at this list, again, and thinking back to the examples that we talked about at the very beginning of your own problem solving, your own executive function skills, we're talking about planning. For a young child or an adolescent, this might look like taking a homework task and breaking it down. A 13-year-old who has to write a paper for English class in school doesn't just automatically do it in an hour before it's due. They may try to do that. They may not be very successful. In the same way, a 4-year-old who's trying to build a block structure is not just going to dump a bunch of blocks together and be successful. You have to plan it, you have to break it down, you have to think through how it's going to work. Focused attention and filtering distractions. We talked about that. Some children, some adults are naturally better at this than others. Being able to filter out distractions is the way that most of us get things done because we're bombarded with millions and millions of things happening. And a great example of this that we see in a lot of kids and a lot of adolescents, kids who are obsessed with their phones. And no matter what's going on, if their phone beeps because they have a text message, they've got to look at it. Or if something flashes up on Snapchat or Instagram, they've got to look at it, they've got to pay attention to it. So learning how to focus attention, how to filter distractions, whether that's mentally making yourself focus or whether that's using external help. So things like turning off your phone, putting your phone in your purse, turning off your email so it doesn't pop up reminders while you're working on an important task, those kinds of things. Another important one, remembering instructions even when you're interrupted. It would be very nice in our world if we always got to focus on one thing, see it all the way through, and then move on to the next task. How often does that actually happen in your everyday life? Just as an example, this morning I placed an order for something. I approved a student to register for my fall class. I worked on a grant budget. I tested these slides and the audio to make sure they were working and so on. And I'm not extraordinary. I'm not pointing this out as something that I've done that's unusual. We do these kinds of things all the time. And so if somebody had come in and told me, you need to do this, you need to do it in this period of time, and here's how I need it, I would need some way of remembering that while I was approving the student or while I was getting this webinar ready to go. So you've got to be able to hold that information in memory. Appropriate multitasking. There's a lot of research these days on multitasking, on whether humans are actually capable of multitasking, and the consensus seems to be we're probably not as capable of it as we think we are. But in some senses, you have to be able to balance and juggle multiple things, if not at the same moment in time, then in quick succession. And you have to be able to know when I finish this task, I've got to go back to that other one. Prioritizing tasks and setting goals goes along with planning. Also, we have to evaluate our progress toward goals, and that's true of small projects. That's true of our year of programmatic work and of our career progress. And so, setting your goals and then evaluating your progress toward them. And then impulse control and self-regulation. If I'm well planned, I know what I'm doing, I'm multitasking, I've got my goals, but I can't stop myself from checking my email every 3 seconds, I'm not necessarily going to be as successful. So knowing how and learning strategies for controlling impulses when you don't need to express them, and regulating your own behavior, both for cognitive kinds of skills, but also for successfully getting along with others. So these are all examples of the places and the kinds of skills that are needed for executive function. All right. Some more information about what's going on in the brain related to executive function. And these three abilities highlighted in blue here are sort of the foundation as we think about how do we support children and how do we support adolescents in developing these things. These three interrelated kinds of brain function are really the foundation. Working memory, we've already talked about. The ability to actively work with things that you are remembering, to manipulate information in your memory. Cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to switch gears to, if one thing doesn't work, if one solution doesn't work, to take another approach. Kim, you mentioned the changes in your county. I'm imagining you've had to use a lot of cognitive flexibility. You thought about how extension was going to work in some ways, and you've gotten new information, and so now you have to approach things in different ways. And then that inhibitory self-control that we just talked about. The ability, no matter how much you want to go back to the people in your county and say, that's stupid, that's ridiculous, we're not doing it that way, to understand that they provide money that funds your position, and so therefore just telling them off is probably not the most productive way of handling things. These are the three things that are required for successful completion of all of these tasks that we just talked about. And all three of these have to work together in order to really be successful with executive function. Now, these abilities develop in different ways and at different rates. So there are times in development when children may be better at some of them than others. They may be really good with memory, but they may not have very good self-control. They may have good self-control, but not have the flexibility to change tracks if something isn't working. And so what we want to do as we're thinking about nurturing executive function in children, in adolescents, is to help them with all three of these component skills. We do know that even though these skills are not fully developed until early adulthood, the foundations begin developing in infancy. These are not skills that anybody is born with, so they're not innate, but the experiences that we have and the support that we get and the practice that we have in supportive environments all help us to build these executive function skills. There are reasons why we don't put 4-year-olds in charge of your extension office. And among them are the fact that they don't have these skills well developed. And kids don't, again, these are not innate skills, so kids don't necessarily just have them and all of a sudden one day they're able to use them. They've got to practice with the support of adults who help them learn from their mistakes, help them do these tasks in the beginning, and then over time remove the supports and let them do them themselves. That's a process that we call scaffolding, this term in blue down here. We scaffold progress when we start out by providing a substantial amount of support, and then over time, as children and adolescents become more skillful, we gradually remove these supports and give them the opportunity to take on more and more of the responsibility themselves. If you think about a very simple example, getting dressed in the morning. For an infant, we provide very substantial scaffolding for this task. For the youngest infants, we do it all for them. They do not have the cognitive skills or the motor skills to dress themselves. As kids get a little older, we may start letting them play some role. The parents may put the pants on the child, but let them pull them up. Excuse me, a little coughing fit there. The parents may put the shirt over the child's head, let them put their arms in and pull it down. As kids get older, we expect them to start learning to do pieces of these tasks themselves. And as they get older and older, it's an expectation, here are your clothes, go put them on. And then over time, we expand that to actually having them go select their clothes, figure out what they're wearing, and and take full responsibility for that task. That's a great example of what scaffolding looks like. And we do that with very simple tasks. We do that with much more complex tasks. If you think about teaching a child who's never written a paper for a homework assignment how to write a paper, we provide a lot of support in the beginning. Teachers are going to provide a lot of support in the beginning. By the time students get to my upper division college class, when I expect them to write a paper, I'm not going to sit down and teach them how to do all of the research, how to take notes, how to write an outline, how to develop a thought, those kinds of things. I'll provide them structure for the specific assignment, but I'm not going to provide them with the basic instruction on how to write a paper. That's removing that scaffolding support. So again, the foundations of executive function we know begin in early childhood. And there are several research studies that show us that some of these abilities that children develop early have an effect on how successful they are later on. So there's a good study showing us that certain abilities in infancy that are related to working memory and related to inhibition of certain activities predict executive functions at age 11. And so attention, processing speed, memory, when babies were as young as 7 to 12 months old, provide pretty good prediction of how well kids are going to be able to do things like inhibit their impulses and shift their focus when they're 11 years old. So it's important to start in infancy providing support for those things. And those of you in Family and Consumer Sciences especially have opportunities to teach these skills to parents, to child care providers, to teachers, to after-school people, to camp staff, those kinds of things. And encourage teachers and parents, even very young, to provide opportunities for these kinds of skills. We also know that executive function skills predict other things. So children's ability to do some of these executive function skills at the beginning of preschool, their ability to pay attention, their ability to remember things, actually predicts their vocabulary at the end of preschool. So having these abilities to focus, to attend to things, to use information in working memory, predicts their vocabulary. And receptive vocabulary, the number of words that you understand, is an important predictor of reading skill, both in kindergarten and at the end of 3rd grade. And so, it makes a lot of sense. If you're better at remembering things, you're better at paying attention, then you're going to be more likely to learn new vocabulary and to learn more words. This third one is important because it shows us that not only babies, but also mothers affect how executive function develops. And in this particular study, what we know from measures of 10-month-old babies is that the electrical activity in the frontal lobe of their brain, the frontal lobe we looked at a minute ago in this slide, the cerebral cortex, the frontal lobe here where executive function is controlled, is a predictor of executive function both in preschool and at the end of kindergarten. But the same is also true of how positive moms are and the positive mood that they show in the presence of their 10-month-old babies. So babies who have moms who are more positive when they are 10 months old tend to have better executive functions in preschool and at the end of kindergarten. And so these two things together seem to predict executive function. So all of these studies show us that the foundations of this executive function come along or start in early childhood. That doesn't mean those of you who are in 4-H don't have an important role to play, because again, these skills are not well developed until at least early adulthood. So it's a long developmental process. And we know that there are some critical factors that contribute to executive functioning, especially in young children, but really these same things also matter as kids get older. One is relationships. Remember in the last slide that the positive emotion that mothers showed predicted their children's executive function. Everything that children do is based in an environment of relationships. And those are relationships with family members, teachers, medical professionals, foster parents, peers, 4-H leaders, camp counselors, and so on. And so adults who are able to be supportive of children, to model these executive function skills, to be consistent, reliable, predictable, to guide children dependably, to protect them from the chaoses of a stressful environment, but to also help them to learn how to deal with and manage their own emotions, are going to help children to be successful in these skills. The next piece is engagement opportunities, and this has everything to do with the experiences that babies and children and adolescents have. Remember that executive function skills are developed based on experience. Kids who never get the chance to practice these skills are not going to be successful at them later in life and later in development. And so having activities and providing experiences that promote emotional, social, cognitive, and physical development are going to help children build these skills. So social connections matter. For young children, play, creative play, open-ended play makes a difference. For kids and adolescents of all age, having physical activity, regular, vigorous physical activity makes a big difference. There's a lot of evidence that being physically active is a positive part of brain development for all ages. These activities and these opportunities have to increase in complexity as kids get older. You would not give the same kind of puzzle or game or activity to a 2-year-old that you would to your 15-year-old 4-Hers. You have to understand where children are developmentally and to provide activities that challenge them without overwhelming them and without being so difficult that they just get frustrated. And then the places where children and adolescents are. This photograph is a good example of one of the very most basic things, the need for physical safety, providing the appropriate restraints in cars, providing an environment that's safe, setting up an environment where the surroundings are safe enough that it's okay for kids and adolescents to explore within the limits of their abilities. And we do this in early childhood settings, we do this at home, we do this at 4-H camp, we do this in other 4-H and youth kinds of events, where we set up an opportunity and we set up structures and rules and limits that help keep kids safe while still providing opportunities for them to explore. What would a 4-H event be like if you had to have everybody in the 4-H group be together and holding hands going everywhere together at every second? How many of you 4-H agents would stay in your job if that was the kind of expectation of 4-H? We know that what's appropriate for kids that age is different than what's appropriate for younger children, but no matter the age, kids have to have that space, that environment that's safe and secure and predictable. So this is sort of the background in terms of what executive function is, what kids need, what adolescents need. We're going to transition from here to talk a little bit more about some specific ideas, some specific activities that can actually help to support executive function. And I want to back up for just a second because I want to remind you of these three things that are the most important here: working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory self-control. As we look at these activities moving forward, I want you to think about some of the ways that kids are practicing memory, flexibility, and self-control. And keep in mind, as I share some of these are only a few examples of a whole wide range of possibilities. And these are really meant more than anything to get you thinking about how the kinds of activities that you do with kids of different ages actually help build these skills. So let's start by thinking about infants. And we're really thinking here about approximately 6 to 18-month-olds. Younger than 6 months, a lot of time and effort is focused on much more basic skills and relationships. It does not mean you can't do some of these things with younger kids, but these are the ages, or 6 months is about the age where we expect some of these very basics of working memory, inhibitory self-control, and cognitive flexibility to start being in place. So that's really where we're focusing, thinking of how you support executive function in children this age. So as you look at this list of activities, think how simple these are. A basic game of peekaboo. When you think about peekaboo, what happens? You hold up something to separate your face from the baby's face, and then you wait a second, there's anticipation going on, the baby's paying attention, and then you remove the cloth and you say peekaboo. And there's surprise, there's giggling. All of you have done this or seen this with adults with children. Some of the things that babies have to work on to understand and to enjoy peekaboo, they've got to have some working memory. They've got to understand a little bit about what's going on. They've got some anticipation going on. Once they've seen this game over and over again, on some level they know, okay, what's going to happen next? She's going to drop that cloth, and I'm going to see my mom, and I'm going to giggle, and this is going to be really fun. They've also got to have a very basic self-control so that they don't grab the cloth, they follow the timing of the adult, they don't start laughing, they don't lose attention and lose focus in the middle of the game. And so it's just a very, very simple example. Simple imitation games do the same kind of thing, where you make a face and babies make a face back at you. You make sounds. They make sounds back at you. With a 6-month-old, they may go ba, 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 and we may go ba, 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 ga, 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 ba, 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 ba. And part of what we're trying to teach them is how to imitate and how to act out the things we're doing. Same thing with hand motions, clapping, those kinds of things. Again, you're requiring working memory, self-control, and also some recall. You have to be able to keep things in memory, and you have to be able to act them out and do what you just saw or what you just heard. Another important piece of executive function, and this is true for infants, it's also true for toddlers, preschoolers, to some degree school-age kids as well, is pretend play. Acting like somebody else, acting out another role. In infants, this is very, very simple. This may be picking up mom's cell phone and holding it to your head. You may not understand everything about what you're doing, but you've seen it happen. Again, you're using your memory, you're attending to something, you are focusing your actions, and it requires some self-control, some self-regulation to do this thing that you want to do. Pretend play gets much more complex as children get older. They act like mom and dad, they act like their teacher, they play school, they start to play grocery store and other kinds of things. And all of these activities work on pretend play. Finger plays that we do with kids. 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed. One fell off and bumped his head. There are fine motor aspects of this, learning to control your hands and fingers, language skills, self-control, attention, memory, all of those things that are happening as children are learning these finger plays. And then conversation, simple language. For many 6 to 18-month-olds, the actual content of the conversation is a little more one-sided. The adults are the ones, or the older children or the teenagers are the ones who provide the language that is a part of the conversation. But children respond, even young babies respond. And as you're having a conversation with them, as you're narrating what's going on, as you're saying, what do you think? Should we go fix some lunch? And babies smiling and giggling and kicking feet and all of those kinds of things. They're also practicing some important things. They're practicing a very rudimentary form of perspective taking. They're learning through practice, through repetition, that when it's not my turn, I need to not interact. I need to wait. I need to pay attention when the other person's done so that I know when to respond. They're using memory. They're focusing their attention and so on. These are very, very simple kinds of activities, but they're good examples of the very basic things that we do and that we can do to encourage executive function in our very youngest children. When we move on thinking about toddlers, that we're talking about 1.5 years to about age 3, they're much more mobile, they're much more capable in terms of physical motor skills, their language is developing, their cognitive abilities are developing. Think about some of these kinds of games. Very simple active games, throwing and catching, jumping, walking on a line, walking on a low balance beam, those kinds of things. Of course, require gross motor skills, but also require memory of what you're doing and of what the expectations are. Very focused attention. If you've ever watched a toddler trying to balance on something, they are paying very, very careful attention. And then it requires self-control and self-regulation. If I'm going to walk on a balance beam, I don't need to just all of a sudden stop and turn around and look at what's behind me, because I'm going to lose my balance and I'm going to fall off. And so these kinds of active games help to practice those skills. Again, think about something like Follow the Leader, which is a great example of an active game, but it's also, I just pulled it out as a separate example because it's one that also requires recall. If I'm going to follow the leader, I have to watch, pay attention, and remember what somebody else is doing, and then I've got to recall it, and I've got to control my own actions to be able to do it. A popular activity with kids this age is a freeze dance kind of game, and you could also use this with preschoolers, sometimes even with older elementary age kinds of kids, where you're playing music or something, and then all of a sudden at an unexpected time you stop. And so with this, and the idea is that they're supposed to stop moving while the music's off and hold still until you start playing the music again. Sort of a very rudimentary form of the activity that will eventually go into games like musical chairs. Again, focused attention, motor control, active inhibition of actions. You want to move, you want to dance, you want to jump, and you have to very actively work both in your motor skills but also in your thinking skills on how to stop my body from moving. Now, a lot of toddlers aren't very successful at this, and it takes a lot of reminder, a lot of practice, but it's a great way to practice these skills. Another one with toddlers, songs with movements. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes is a good example. Requires language in a structured way, both gross and fine motor skills, so both those body and those finger skills, memory, attention, and then the physical self-control to follow and copy the movements. And then there are things like matching and sorting games. Toddlers love to put things in buckets and dump them out, to stack things, to fit nesting cups together, to fit shapes into shape sorters, all those kinds of things. And they're practicing a lot of working memory, cognitive flexibility, understanding the rules, following the rules, trying something new. If I'm trying to put this circle into a square hole and it doesn't work, I'm going to eventually have to figure out that I either need to set down the circle and pick up a square, or I need to find a different hole to try and fit it into. So these kinds of games and activities can provide some ways to practice that cognitive flexibility that's going to be really important. All right, moving on to thinking about preschool-age children. And we're expanding on the same kinds of activities. Pretend play. Pretend play gets more complex. This is where you may see elaborate superhero themes, space themes, camping themes, anything that you can imagine. And in addition to everything else that children were doing with earlier pretending, they're following rules, remembering ideas, inhibiting their impulses, and sometimes more and less successfully. Storytelling is a great way to practice executive function in preschoolers, both telling stories to children, having them tell stories, playing games where you tell part of a story and then others add to it. Again, complex thinking, working memory. If you do the game where you tell a piece of the story, then the next person tells it, you have to use cognitive flexibility, because if you've got an idea but the person ahead of you throws a different twist into the story, you've got to rethink how you're going about it. Repeating and expanding songs. 5 green and speckled frogs sitting on a speckled log is, those kinds of songs, repeating songs require cognitive flexibility, complex language, memory. Where are we in the song? How many speckled frogs do we have now? What happens when the third one jumps into the pool? And so on. And so those kinds of things are also practicing these skills. Complex puzzles, where you're using working memory. You're having to plan. If you're trying to fit together a bunch of puzzle pieces, you have to plan how these are going to come together. And then cooking activities are great for this age. They're also great for children who are older. You've got to follow directions. You've got to focus your attention. You have to be accurate. If you're baking a cake and it calls for a cup of flour and you put in half a cup, it's not going to go very well. So the accuracy, the attention, all of those kinds of things can happen in cooking activities. Okay, moving on to talk about school-agers. I'm going to cruise through this quickly because I want to spend a little bit of time talking a little more specifically about adolescence. Card games, board games, things like Go Fish, Slapjack, concentration games, those kinds of things. Active games, more complicated rules, musical chairs, Simon Says, the organized sports. Some of those decision-making and memory skills are important. Playing a musical instrument, singing in rounds, complicated clapping games, Miss Mary Mac and things like that a lot of the girls do, when they're in elementary school. Logic games, brain teasers, those kinds of things are all working on these three basic: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. All right, I want to talk a little bit more about adolescence, in part because I know that a good number of you work with either young or older or adolescents or both. And we know that the adolescent brain is still developing, and in particular, this executive function part of the brain is still developing. And there are big differences in the planning, problem solving, and judgment skills of a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old. Some of the key changes that we know go on in the adolescent brain. There's an overall increase in the gray matter, which is the major processing part of the brain, which leads to things like a quicker reaction time, better reasoning abilities, improvements in impulse control. We also know, though, that hormone changes come in during adolescence. And so the changes in hormones offset some of these better reasoning abilities, reaction time, and affect how kids deal with stress and their social behavior, how they relate to and interact with others. And so in adolescence especially, we know that the parts of the brain responsible for emotional responses are better developed than the parts that are responsible for self-control. I'm assuming that none of you are all that surprised by this, that teenagers as well as younger children are more controlled by emotions and more affected by emotional content than logical thinking, and they're not always able to override these emotional impulses in order to think more carefully and logically. So this brings with it some issues that we don't deal with as much in younger kids. One of them is an ongoing issue, continuing challenges with impulse control. How many of you 4-H agents have had something happen on a trip, at camp, at DPA, anything like that, where some 4-H'er said to some other 4-H'er, I know, what if we... and everybody else doesn't. Anybody ever had, give me a check mark if you've ever had that kind of an experience. I know, what would happen if we, and they do something that may not be the very best idea ever. I'm sure that others besides Laura are familiar with this experience. And so some of the effect sometimes is that we see an increase in risk-taking behaviors in teenagers because they're at this they have this unique combination of more freedom but still working on this impulse control. And so with some teenagers in some settings. Now not every kid does these things, but we see increases overall in risk-taking behaviors such as drinking alcohol, smoking, using drugs, sexual experimentation, and so on. Oh, Laura, great example. Sometimes it's as silly as a funny catchphrase that they're trying to get others to pick up. Susan's got a great question. Why do some take more risks than others? That appears to be at least partly just personality-based. Some people are naturally more risk takers than others. Some are more risk-averse than others. In adolescence, everybody's tendency to take risks is more magnified, but some kids and some adults are more risk takers than others. So quick, and then there are issues with driving a car that we'll talk about in just a second. Very quickly, let's cruise through what some of this looks like. In terms of sleep, teenagers require as much sleep time as elementary kids, but don't always get it. And the challenge a lot of times is that sleep patterns actually physically change with puberty. So where younger kids can and do want to go to sleep earlier, adolescents' brains and their biology really shifts so that they're not tired until later, and then they're not tired until, or they don't wake up as easily. And as Susan points out, they try to catch up on Saturday and sometimes Sunday. And so there are big differences in weekday and weekend sleep-wake patterns. And we see consequences. Higher injury risk, school performance, negative mood, increased stimulant use in kids who aren't getting enough sleep. So things like school start times are a big issue for adolescents because biologically it is much harder for them to get up and be at school at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. In terms of alcohol, there are a couple of things that are important to know about alcohol. And again, not all adolescents use alcohol, not all adults use alcohol. But when it happens, we know that teens' brains, because of where they are developmentally, actually process alcohol differently than adult brains do. So just statistically, adults tend to drink more overall. The total consumption is actually higher in adults than it is in teens, which is probably not a big surprise. When teens drink, they are more likely than adults to binge drink. And a lot of this has to do with how the brain processes alcohol and how teenagers think about alcohol. It may also have something to do with the access that they do or don't have. The scary part, and what we need to pay attention to, is that we know that regular alcohol use in adolescence specifically can cause long-term impairments in brain functioning. There's not a clear line where if you drink less than a certain amount, you're fine, and if you drink more than that certain amount, magically you're not. It has a lot to do with your own biology and your own genetics and so on, but we do know that regular alcohol use can be a risk, and the risk of alcohol dependence is higher both in people who are drinking when they're younger and binge drinkers. And if you think about adolescents, they're more likely to binge drink and they're drinking younger. And so there are risks associated with alcohol use. And a lot of teenagers don't realize this. It also has to be said that just telling them, you know, you're going to be at risk if you keep drinking is not enough to motivate a lot of adolescents because they don't always have a lot of future sense. Talk for just a second about driving, because this is a big issue. And it's a big issue because we put adolescents in charge of cars at a time when their brains are not fully developed. And this ad I love, and I showed you both just the graphic and the entire ad that was came out from Allstate Insurance in 2009. And I love it because what it's got is a big car-shaped hole in the prefrontal cortex of the 16-year-old brain. And Allstate was making an important point about the fact that adolescent drivers need help and support in learning how to drive well, because in part these impulse control parts of the brain are not well developed. And we know that motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for 15 to 20-year-olds. Teens tend to take more risks when they're driving. They're more likely to take risks when they've got other teens in the car with them. And driving is a complex set of skills that requires time and experience. And so while those adolescent brains are still developing, Georgia and a lot of other states have built in a program to try to help mitigate some of these risks. So Georgia has a graduated driver's license. Anybody who has a kid who's gone through driver's training recently knows this. You can get an instructional permit at age 15. At age 16, when you've met driver's education and road experience requirements, you can get an intermediate level license. And when you have that license, you pass your road test, you've had your driver's ed, you've had a documented amount of road experience before you take that driver's test. There are limits on when and how you're allowed to drive. Very strict limits on cell phone use while driving. Obviously no texting, which is against the law in Georgia, but also no telephone calling. And kids, 16, 17-year-old licensed drivers caught making a call when they have this intermediate license can have their license revoked. And there are a lot of restrictions on the passengers you can carry. Remember, risk-taking is higher when teens have other teens in the car. So for the first 6 months of your intermediate license, you're only allowed to have your immediate family in the car with you, nobody else, no friends. If you don't get in an accident, in the next 6 months, you can have no more than one non-related passenger under 21. So you can have one friend in the car with you. If you still don't get into an accident in those 12 months, the rest of the time until you turn 18, you can have no more than 3 non-related passengers under 21. And then if you if you still don't have an accident, you're able to get your full license at age 18. If you do have an accident, then your time for some of this intermediate licensing starts over again. There are also limits on driving hours. Teenagers are not allowed to drive after certain hours or before certain hours in the morning. Again, the risk is higher at night and earlier in the morning. We're running low on time, so I want to highlight some of the things that we can do that those of you who work with adolescents or who work with adults with adolescents can do to help mitigate risk-taking. And then I want to talk about a couple of activities or ways that you can support executive functioning in adolescence. One big thing is to set the stage for good adolescent decision making. Building relationships. The time you spend getting to know your 4-H'ers, the time that you spend getting to know the kids you're working with at camp, any of you who are working with kids, or the time that child care providers spend getting to know kids, even younger kids, sets the stage for good decision making, because kids who have solid relationships, both in adolescence and earlier, tend to do better with executive function. Providing opportunities for independence and decision making. This is where your fax agents can help, helping child care providers and parents understand. Give kids simple choices when they're younger. If the first time kids have ever made a decision is when they're 16, it's going to be hard. So we start by allowing a 15-month-old to decide if they want to wear the red or the blue shirt. And then as they get older, they can take on more complex decisions so that they're ready to make big decisions. Open communication, listening, being askable, being the kind of person that kids can come to and say, you know, my friends all want me to come to a party on Saturday where there's going to be alcohol. What should I do? Being available and willing and non-judgmental is important. Having appropriate expectations for adolescents, setting those limits, enforcing them, and explaining them. With adolescents, my way or the highway is not the way to go. It's important to explain to them, why is it that this is a rule? Why is it that girls and boys can't go into each other's cabins at camp, for example? Explaining why it is, being specific about what is appropriate, and then especially as adolescents get older and more independent, creating safety plans in advance. If you've been at a party and you've been drinking, what do you do? If you find yourself in a situation that you don't know how to handle, who can you call? What do you do instead of driving home drunk? Those kinds of things. Setting up those plans in advance. Responding appropriately to risk-taking. So if you have a safety plan, following through on it first. Using consequences as teaching opportunities rather than rescuing teens from every case of bad judgment. Now, of course, there are times when we want to step in, support kids, help them through it, but also allowing them to understand, when I made this decision, here's what happens, and I've got to deal with the consequences of this. While also continuing, of course, to provide support and be patient because the brain is still developing. And the good news is a lot of the activities that we do with adolescents, and if you think about 4-H activities, you can see these kinds of things. Goal setting and planning help with this executive function. Learning positive self-talk, and that's not just, oh, I'm so great, oh, I'm so wonderful, but talking yourself through a task, evaluating how you did, encouraging yourself, I can do this, I can break this down, I can plan, I can solve this problem. Journaling, sports, music, theater, those related arts kinds of activities all require skill development, selective attention, working memory. Strategy games, logic puzzles, some complex video games can all help with all of these executive function skills. And then teaching study skills, teaching leadership skills, independent thinking, breaking down complex tasks, monitoring. A lot of these sound like the things that you do in a lot of 4-H leadership activities. All right, I'm going to skip the next couple of slides for just a minute. What I've got here are some resources. I will send all of you a copy of these slides so that you can refer to them as well. But I'm interested in the minute and a half, 2 minutes that remain. These things always take longer than I expect. To hear from you any so whats. How could this influence what you're doing? How might you use this to help other adults, to help the kids you're working with? What else do you want to know? All of those kinds of things. Some quick conversation or text chat about what this means for you. And I promise I won't keep you but a couple more minutes. But I'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts about how this might help what you're doing. And if anybody's got a phone or a mic and wants to talk, you're welcome to do that too.
This is Laura. I was just going to say, knowing the brain development levels and where youth are at in maturity and puberty-wise helps set up age groups and what's appropriate for 4-H teams or 4-H youth to stay in cabins together. So I feel like as 4-H, we're right now in the process of really considering making some changes, or they might already be made. We're going to find out on Tuesday next week, but it really helps set up appropriate age levels for our youth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of difference in maturity level of kids at different ages. Kim says this information can be and is incorporated into their parenting education program, which is great. And Kim, I'm glad to help you find other resources if you want to expand on this. Terry, overall interest for your own parenting and also working with kids to encourage more independence. And I think that's great that there are interconnections between what you're doing as a parent of a 20-month-old and what you're doing in 4-H and what you're how you're interacting with kids. Please keep talking, typing if you've got ideas. I want to back up. I'm going to send you all of these resources, but I actually want to highlight the particular one here that is enhancing and practicing executive function skills with children from infancy to adolescence. That's the piece that I used for some of the specific examples that I shared. It's about a 20-page free PDF booklet that has a lot more information, a lot more examples for all of the different age groups and a lot more specific ideas that I couldn't incorporate into these slides. And so if you're looking for specific kinds of activities, examples, links to help with independence, to help with problem solving, with inhibitory self-control and all of those different skills, this is a fantastic resource for that. I see a couple others are typing. I'm going to let you go ahead and do that. As you're doing that, I'm going to back up and show you there's some other resources, especially if you're educating adults. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has some of the best materials on executive function. There's a very brief update. There is a key concepts paper. There's a video. There's all kinds of other information as well. Home visiting parenting education programs Jennifer mentioned. So yes, working with teen moms is a great specific case where brain development really matters, not only in the development of the babies or toddlers or preschoolers that they have, but also the brain development of the adolescent, him or herself, makes a big difference. Because a teen mom is in a different place as far as brain development than an adult, and how you approach parenting and help them with parenting depends not only on them, but also on or not only on their child, but also on their own developmental level. So that's another great example. I also want to point out this Mind in the Making link down here. Mind in the Making is a big website resource that has a lot of information, activities, and so on. There is a book called Mind in the Making by Ellen Galinsky, who's a big child development, early childhood researcher and expert. That's been another really helpful resource. And again, I'll send all of these to you. Any other thoughts? I don't want to keep you forever. I promised that this was going to be an hour. So I want to remind you, first and foremost, that I am available if this is a topic that interests you. I've been doing in my brain development work a lot of teaching on this recently. And for those of you fax agents who are Better Brains for Babies educators, we're incorporating a lot more of this information into Better Brains for Babies, and you'll get some updates through that program on it as well. But those of you who are not yet Better Brains for Babies educators, there's a lot of information I'd be glad to share with you and help you figure out how to use this stuff. I'm also going to send you a link to an online session evaluation. If you would complete that survey, that would be a big help for me, because that helps me to know what you learned and how I could improve things like this in the future. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you could incorporate this, and I appreciate you all taking the time. I'm going to stop the recording and hang out for a few minutes in case anybody's got questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day.